podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Triangulation, episode 429, recorded Saturday, February 19th, 2022. Amy Webb and the Genesis Machine. Our annual survey is almost done. We'd like to get your thoughts. We want your feedback. Go to twit.tv/survey22 to take it now before it closes at the end of the month. The survey helps us understand our audience so we can make your listening experience even better. It just shouldn't take more than a few minutes. Go to twit.tv/survey22 to take it, and thanks in advance. If you'd like to support the TWiT Podcast Network, you could join Club TWiT for $7 a month, ad-free versions of all of our shows. We also give you access to the Club TWiT Discord and shows like Stacy's Book Club, the Untitled Linux Show, This Week in Space, and a whole lot of special events. Plus, the TWiT Plus feed with material that doesn't appear in any other podcast. Club TWiT, $7 a month. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support. Hey, everybody. Yes, it's time for Triangulation. We haven't done a Triangulation in a while, but when you get a chance to talk to somebody like Amy Webb, you take it. Amy is one of my favorite guests. She's a regular on TWiT, of course, and has written a couple of really important and very interesting books. You can see them actually on the set. We've interviewed her for all of them, I believe. The Signals Are Talking, which was about being a futurist and how futurists work. The Big Nine, which is about the big 9 tech companies in the U.S. and in China. And she's got a brand new one that is really compelling. This just came out on Valentine's Day. The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. Welcome, Amy Webb. It's great to talk to you.
Hey, Leo. It's always great to talk to you.
I don't know if we did a triangulation on the Signals Are Talking, but we had you on Twitter.
Yeah, it was early. That was pretty early on. I think I met you after that.
Yeah, I think it was after that. Anyway, this has been, we've been talking over the last couple of years. You've been working on this book with Andrew Hessel, who is a scientist working in biotech, right?
Right. I actually started working on this book while I was writing the last book, which if anybody is out there writing a book, I don't recommend.
One at a time, please.
Yeah, one at a time. But it's interesting. A lot of the same companies, a lot of the same people in AI cross over into biology. And I was just really curious as to why that was the case. And that led me down this rabbit hole that I found hard getting back out of. And now there's a book about it.
It's really a fascinating subject. And it kind of begins with CRISPR. Actually begins even earlier with Genentech in the 70s. Coming up with a synthetic insulin, which was a lifesaver, quite literally, for type 1 diabetics. But genetic and synthetic biology is really something somewhat new, thanks to machine learning, the speed of our computers and things like that. It is a world we've talked about for years, but it's finally kind of started to happen, right?
Yeah. So for those of you not familiar with this term, synthetic biology, much like AI, synthetic biology is just an umbrella term that encompasses many different biotechnologies. And the point of synthetic biology is to redesign or to design organisms to have new and improved purposes. And the way that you do that is by using genetic code instead of binary. So in the world of AI and the world of computers, we have ones and zeros. And in biology, there's ACTG. Those are the building blocks of life. And if we can get to the code level of life, then that gives us a lot of new opportunities, a lot of new ways to influence what the outcomes might be. And that means we could potentially make life at the molecular level adaptable to different environments, or to create new versions of life to have different purposes. So these techniques are going to give us more control over nature. It does at some point influence the future of how we as humans evolve, but in the nearer term, it's going to give us optionality to deal with climate change and some of the other existential threats we're managing.
And you're, of course, a futurist. We've talked about that on our shows before. So you like to think about trends and think how companies can strategize. In this case, it's really not just companies, it's how we as humans strategize for a very different world. The first half of the book talks about the various technologies and what they are. The second half is fun. It's a projection into the future, what the future might look like if some of these technologies take over. What do you think what are the big technologies that are coming that we're going to see really change our world?
Yeah, so I think maybe it's useful to just break down tiny bit how all of this works, because for those who are fans of all of your shows, they're really interested in tech. And this is very much so this is like very much the tech side of biotech. The people who are working in this field largely they have engineering backgrounds who also happen to get interested in biology. So they're engineers, they're computer scientists. And basically the way to think about this is that we can program biological structures the way that we program computers, or at least similarly to how we program computers. So DNA sequences, they get loaded into software tools. You can imagine a kind of text editor or like an old school HTML editor, but for DNA code. And if you know how to read and use the code, you just make edits. And then once that code has been written to, satisfaction, then a new DNA molecule gets printed from scratch on something akin to a DNA printer. That part of the process, by the way, is called synthesis. Do we have DNA printers now? Oh yeah. In fact, China is home to one of the world's largest companies. It's called BCI Genomics, that does a lot of the synthesis, a lot of the printing.
Wow. And
today you can print out DNA chains that are several thousand base pairs long, and you can create things like new pathways within cells. You can even recreate a cell's entire genome. But it's because of AI that we've started to see this huge boost in the field. And basically, the better that AI becomes, the more biological applications that we're going to be able to test and build. So that brings me back to what you asked, which is, well, what's out there? Shucks, I meant to send you a bottle of this. I will do this, Leo.
A bottle of what?
A bottle of bourbon.
Oh, okay.
I just realized I forgot to send it to you.
So there's genetically synthesized bourbon?
Yes. And I will order one tonight and make sure that you get it. So there's a company that is making bourbon, or it's making whiskey that has the same type of flavor profile that, a barrel-aged whiskey that has taken forever to make, many, many years. But they start by sort of deconstructing the genetic profile of a whiskey that they like, and then they put it in a bioreactor instead of in a oak barrel. And, it's ready in a matter of weeks versus, 16, 20, 30 years.
So, but that's just chemistry, right? I mean, that's not life.
Just chemistry.
That's just chemistry.
No. So that's chemistry. Let me give you an example of life. So about a week ago, as we are talking right now, was the Super Bowl, and Americans ate a staggering amount of chicken. Do you know what? I don't know what you saw.
The number one thing people eat in the Super Bowl is chicken?
Yeah.
Wings.
Well, not the whole
wings.
chicken.
A lot of wings.
Yeah. So, right. 1.45 billion wings is what I saw. So, that's an obscene amount for one day. That's an obscene amount of chicken.
That's a lot
wings.
of flightless chickens out there.
It's a lot. Well, right. So it's a lot of chickens, and commercial chicken farms aren't like the most humane places to grow up if you're a chicken. They produce a lot of waste. It's not great for the environment. So what if there was another way to do it? What if you started instead with a stem cell line from a heritage chicken, like chickens that were never treated with antibiotics and weren't forced to grow quickly, and you took those stem cells and you incubated them inside of something called a bioreactor. Picture like a huge pressure cooker, and you put into that bioreactor some delicious amino acids, which would have been the same things that the stem cells would have fed on inside of a mother hen. Anyways,
it'd be just like bourbon, except you're making chickens.
Just like bourbon. except it tastes like, right. So over time, you get, over a period of weeks versus many, many months, you get actual chicken meat. So it's indistinguishable from the original chicken, except that it didn't require any of the resources. You know, it was much more humane, and there's no antibiotics. There's none of the extra chemicals, no hormones or anything inside of that meat. And it's like chicken that tastes like chicken. I was really disappointed. We were going to go to Hong Kong this month and I wanted to go. There's a shop in Hong Kong that's the first in the world to be serving synthetic chicken. Yeah. So, well, there's actually one in Singapore also. So
maybe it was Singapore.
Yeah. But they're popping up all over the place. And what I find so interesting is that at the moment, this chicken is like $17 per portion. Now, this is,
I remember Sergey Brin eating an Impossible Burger that was like $100,000. But now you can get that at White Castle, right?
Right. Now you can get an Impossible Burger at White Castle?
Yeah.
Do you have White Castle out there? White Castle is my favorite fast food.
Oh, yeah. You can get an Impossible Slider.
I did not know that. That's a very obscure reference. I don't eat a lot of meat, but I love White Castle.
Well, you don't have to. You can now have a slider that has no meat. There wasn't much meat in sliders to begin with.
No, not to start with.
But, okay. I can see, and I think, with the population we have and with the food problems we have, the idea of synthetic meat would solve a lot of problems. Meat is a very expensive thing to produce environmentally. But there's a big problem with this, and that is there is a strong anti-genetically modified organism movement. Look how people act about GMOs. And you have the story in here of golden rice, which is a really good example of this. Would you tell that story?
Sure. It's really an awful, heart-wrenching story that begins with a scientist whose parents escaped the Holocaust. And he knew, he went through incredible suffering as a child and becomes a scientist and decides at some point that he sees malnutrition everywhere and wants to figure out some way to contribute. So this is where the story begins. And he decides after a couple of fits and starts to settle on rice. This is in part because more people eat rice on this planet than just about anything else. And because at the end of his life, Confucius became a foodie, which is like the weirdest thing. Confucius became a super foodie towards the end.
This I did not know.
And wrote in his memoirs effectively that the freshest vegetables, the broccoli, the green of the broccoli looks best set against the absolute white of rice. And so basically what this led to was a boom temporarily and everybody taking all the hull and all the other nutritious parts of the rice off of the rice to just leave behind the starchy interior. And that's kind of what we eat now.
Yeah.
So the problem is that that's filling, but it's not nutritious
it's all the
really
nutrition
at all.
Is stripped off.
Right. So what he thought is there a way that we could engineer a different rice? And what other nutrients could we pack into that rice? And at some point, they figure out how to stuff in a version of beta carotene, which would at least add beta carotene, vitamin A, vitamin K, some other nutrients in. Now, it's not going to be a magic bullet, but something is better than nothing. They go through this entire process. And by the way, it turns out, if you have those deficiencies, you wind up with significant eye problems. Mm-hmm. I actually quote my husband in the book because he's an eye doctor, as you know. And he calls it, when you have that type of deficiency, they call it religion-altering pain because you will pray to any god to make it go away. And it affects children. So they figure out how to make rice that has extra nutrients in it by engineering it in a different way. Everybody's very excited about this. And then it turns out that they, throughout all of this research, had to use a whole bunch of different processes that had patents on them. This is one of the central themes of the books and one of the huge problems that's pervasive throughout all of tech, including biotech, and that's who owns the intellectual property. In this case, there were 70 different patents. And so once they got their proof of concept together, they realized there's no way to give and they wanted to give it away. So they weren't going to sell it. They were just going to give the rice away, but it would have been in violation of everybody's patents. So they wind up with a company that says, listen, big pharma company, we will make the lawyer problems go away in exchange for you allowing us to market and brand the rice and, have it be part of what we're building. But reluctantly, they say yes, which was probably a big mistake. They should have just been patient and tried to find another alternative. But this is what set Greenpeace and other activist groups off, because what they thought would happen would be that initially these farmers would get the rice, they would farm the rice, and then they would become dependent on the big pharma and the big ag companies. That's not what was likely to happen, but these stories and this misinformation, it circles around quickly. And at the end, they finally had a crop that was being piloted, it was being tested, and a bunch of people showed up on the day that they were going to harvest it for a protest. They stomped down and killed the whole crop. And it turns out it wasn't local farmers in the Philippines where this was happening. It was protesters who had been hired and flown in. I completely understand people's concerns when it comes to genetically modified organisms. I partially blame terrible information campaigns around the bovine encephalitis, mad cow disease thing that was happening, whatever that was, 20 years ago, and the way that Dolly the sheep was handled. So I understand that people are absolutely concerned, and there have been problems in the agricultural sector. But, the truth is that most things we consume today or that we are wearing today have been modified to some degree. So we have to make room for change. And the problem is that, misinformation is just escalating and moving so fast at this point that, I worry about what the future might look like as a result.
It's very much like AI. When you say AI, people have that same reaction because of many science fiction films. When you say genetically modified, people have the same reaction. But ultimately,
and actually, you just made me think of something. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
But you mentioned White Castle. Yeah. I do. I love White Castle. It's like the only fast food that I like. And I love it. I grew up in the Midwest and anyways. So I will shove my face full of sliders. And not just sliders. I also like the chicken rings. Picture an onion ring, but it's made out of chicken. That is not a natural shape.
There's no chicken with rings.
All day long. No. Not a chicken wing, a chicken ring. Right. So why, here's the question. Why are we okay? Yeah, but why are we okay eating that?
It's not logical.
It's totally logical. It's just different. And it's like people will eat chicken rings, but a chicken grown in controlled conditions from a stem cell line from a chicken that's never been modified in any way, that somehow is crosses a line.
But the reason I asked you to tell you the golden rice story is it is in a nutshell the whole problem in many different ways. The ideas of patents around this stuff, the natural fears people have around this stuff. Did golden rice eventually, it is now being eaten, right?
So the last that I read was that I think about a month ago or so, they finally have a crop that they think is going to be ready. But this story is 20 years old. Yeah.
And it could have saved millions of lives and untold suffering. But unfortunately, and this is what worries me as I read your book, is that the governmental issues, the human issues, the issues of patents, the issues of greed, all seem so insurmountable. And the other problem is, and I'm going to have you talk a little bit about this, we're at a fork in the road. I mean, it's happening right now, and we're so ill prepared for this. And it could go in a couple of different ways. It could go in a very positive way. It could change the world, but it could also go in a very negative way. And if we aren't prepared to think about it now and have the conversation now, it'll just go whatever way it goes, and probably that's not going to be the best. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. And that's also why the book exists. A lot of times scientists have deep conversations, but they have them behind closed doors. And they're very careful about, who knows what at what point and when. But the challenge on this one is that, if you look at what happened with misinformation around COVID and the messenger RNA vaccines, and not just the misinformation, but a lot of people feel like they were just totally dismissed. And it's fine to be skeptical. You should be skeptical of a new medicine or a new anything. Like, you should ask questions. And I think people really talked down to people, made them feel dumb, which was really unfair. And that just caused this chasm. And so now here we are. And like in a couple of years, the concerns you have about messenger RNA or just what's happening right now is going to be, it's going to be so insignificant compared to what's on the horizon. I'll give you an example. Just a couple of days ago, there's a company in San Diego called Roswell Biotechnologies. They just made a molecular microchip. So we're dealing with all different types of semiconductor chip shortages and chip issues. You're talking a lot about that in all the different shows. Everybody knows this. And part of the problem is the way that the places where the chips are designed, geopolitical tensions, things like that. Well, what if we could shrink components down faster than Moore's law currently allows? We could make a semiconductor chip that's actually smaller than a fingernail. It's smaller, that's microscopic, that can be used as a processor, right? I mean, that is pretty extraordinary. There are microchips in basically every device that we interact with, our cell phones, our computers, our smart devices, like everything. So what if there was a very different way to approach microchips, semiconductors, that changes the relationship that individual countries have with the suppliers at the moment, which are in Taiwan, and Taiwan is sort of embroiled with geopolitical issues with China. Speaking of China,
you talk a lot about that. China is not going to wait, and China has an advantage because they don't have a democratic process, which slows us down in the U.S. and makes it very difficult to get much done. They are completely autocratic, so they have already decided, this is the future, and we are going to be players.
Right. And I want to draw a distinction here because there's the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, which is the government.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's the technologists and the researchers and the scientists who are, I think, overwhelmingly not trying to destroy anything or do bad stuff.
But they all work for the CCP ultimately. So they
sure do. They do. And, it's no secret that China has been out west and forcibly collected without informed consent, DNA from the ethnic minority population, the Uyghurs, and built a national database. Like, unless you're developing specific therapeutics for a tiny fraction of your population, which doesn't make any sense, then what else would you be collecting those data samples for, right? There's a very different, very, very different attitude there toward stem cells and embryos and what's called genetic surgery. So this is going into the embryo and performing edits before it's implanted, or doing the type of editing that is called germline editing, which means that whatever the edits are heritable. They get passed down from generation to generation. We already saw that happen.
A Chinese scientist did it.
That's right.
And by the way, was disappeared. So was that the Chinese government just responding to pressure from the world community, or was that,
It's highly, highly unlikely, given the scope of that study, that this was like a rogue scientist who was just trying to get fame.
That's what they said it was, but
right. I will say this experiment supposedly was done to protect future generations, to make them HIV resistant.
Right.
There's a reason for this. Even in the year 2022, when we have modern medicines and this is now a manageable disease, the stigma in China is unlike anything we've seen in the United States since we first heard about HIV/AIDS. It's really, really bad. So that is supposedly what the research was being done for. However, similar research had been performed in mice, and the purpose of that research was not HIV/AIDS resistance. It was to increase cognitive function. China's got closed doors. It's very hard to get information out. So was this really about HIV/AIDS resistance, or was this about trying to improve cognitive abilities? it's very hard to tell. And it's highly improbable that all of the people, there were many couples, by the way, involved in the study, that they were truly informed in a way that was meaningful. And based on the reaction.
It's hard to imagine that if it seemed to be the case that you could create superhuman intelligence or athletic ability or any variety of things, and that seems to be the case, that at least the Chinese government, the CCP, would not be pursuing that kind of research. Do you think that's possible? They're trying to create superhuman intelligence?
I mean, I definitely think it's possible that there is experimentation happening to see if it's, if they can bump IQs up a couple of clicks. Now, again, we barely understand how the brain works at this point,
it's
and
complicated.
we don't.
Yeah.
It's complicated. We don't entirely understand intelligence, and the current IQ measurements are not always reliable.
The word
that
eugenics conjures up a very scary specter.
Yeah.
And I could see why people would be concerned about that. And again, the knee-jerk reaction to that may end up being stopping some very important research that would be very valuable. Like, for instance, a germline that would make it impossible to catch malaria or HIV would be good, right?
Right. So I think if you talk to any bioethicist out there, and there's like 170 or 190, I forget the number of countries that have come together and decided that germline editing, so heritable gene editing, should be forbidden. And most bioethicists would say the same. What I would say is we need to be open to, first of all, the possibility that somebody's going to do it anyways. We should assume that at some point somebody will, or some country will. And we should also not immediately catastrophize. You can already do genetic selection for something called XXX syndrome. So if you get pregnant, or you're using IVF, in vitro fertilization, you've got some embryos. Typically, they screen embryos now for different markers. If you've got an embryo that has XXX, one of the outcomes of that tends to be much lower IQ, so lower cognitive ability. Okay, so that means you can screen for that. What you cannot do is just screen for markers of lower cognitive ability. I would argue that to some degree, the people who can afford IVF tend to be wealthier. They tend to be, a more homogenous group. In some way, we're already making choices about what future generations look like. And one of the concerns I have, and we explain this in the book, is that I am worried about a future genetic divide. What I'd prefer to see is that these technologies are just discussed about in the open and we make them available to everybody. But at the moment, I don't see that happening.
So we have already seen a variety of Genesis machine type technologies. CRISPR is out there. You mentioned sheep cloning, Dolly. In many cases, these techniques have been disastrous or have been shown to have flaws. I'm reminded of AI, the AI winter we went through, the difficulty in making self-driving cars work. Sometimes I think that maybe we've got this near future that is actually much farther out than we think, much harder to do. Where do you stand on this? How close is this kind of stuff?
So I love, that's a great analogy, Leo, because you're right. The AI winter happened because after 1956, when Minsky and McCarthy and that crew were at Dartmouth thinking about the future of AI, and then others got interested, and then there were media interviews, and they're making these crazy, insane promises, money being thrown at AI and computer science, and the projects failed to materialize. Right. People just didn't have the patience. I'm a little worried of the same thing happening right now, even on a more accelerated track. Just a couple of weeks ago, some biotech veterans raised $3 billion with a B dollars to create Altos Labs on the premise that the machinery of life of cells can be reprogrammed, which, yes, I mean, that's what a lot of this is about. But a $3 billion investment on what kind of value, like what was the valuation for that?
Right.
Right. My worry is that at some point those investors are going to want to see a return. And this has already gone badly for some other companies in the biotech space. There was a company called Amyris that was doing some phenomenal work. And they were scientists, not startups, and not decacorns who knew what to do. And, investors got shaky. And now this is a company that at some point pivoted to biofuels, which was just never going to work. And I think now they're making some type of organic hair care. I forget what they're doing now.
Isn't that sad?
So my point in saying this is, it's just like there's so much capital being thrown at.
We only
at
have a
this
couple
space.
of models. We either have the startup model or we have the government investment model.
Right.
And you talk about the
and
race to
problem is-
sequence the genome in this. And in fact, Craig Venter won because he was willing to play a little fast and loose compared to the government, the NIH and the James Watsons of the world. By the way, I didn't realize, I knew James Watson was a bad man. I had no idea. You have a quote in this book that is reprehensible. The guy, Watson and Crick, of course, discovered DNA after stealing the work of Rosalind Franklin. I'm sorry, I went down a rat hole. But boy, when I read that passage, I went, oh my God, this guy was worse than I ever
it's really
even imagined. Speaking of eugenics, he wanted to make only pretty girls,
Only pretty girls. He didn't like people who were heavier. He had a long list.
And this is recently. This isn't like in the 30s. This is like 20 years ago he's talking about this stuff. So
Watson was kind of a
do we
bad
need
dude.
a new model to get back to the original question? Both the government moves too slowly. Private industry maybe has the wrong priorities, with mostly profit. Do we need a new model for this?
So, Leo, I feel like we've had this conversation before because this is one of the core arguments I made about AI in the last book. Again, we have arrived at a similar point where the federal government in the United States has no long-term plan. We have drastically underfunded science and technology. We got nobody helming long-term decisions. And so therefore the private sector has kind of been responsible for basic research in areas that are really challenging. China doesn't have that problem. So both artificial intelligence and synthetic biology are part of the CCP's what are called 5-year plans. And they produce these 5-year plans, every couple of years, and they execute on them. And they've got sovereign wealth fund money that's dedicated to making sure this gets built out. And they've got this coordinated, very top-down approach. Now, you could argue that that's going to stifle innovation, and it might. But what's going to happen here in the US? I am very concerned that 10 years from now, the arguments we're having today about big tech are going to become arguments about big bio. And AI is one thing, but we're talking about biology, which tends to, it tends to do what it wants. And this is on a planetary scale. So I think it's unforgivable. I'm not saying that the government should go it alone, but we've got to have much better long-term thinking, and we've got to share some of the investment around. Otherwise, everybody's at stake. It's not just like competitive national advantage or strategic advantage. It's us. It's everyday people.
Yeah. You quote a survey in here that says people trust scientists, but they really don't trust science.
Yeah. That's a sad reality. It was a Pew
I don't know
study.
if they trust scientists anymore either, by the way.
I don't know I think that study is about a year old now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's possible that is different now, but I did think it was striking at some point that scientists were up there with like kindergarten teachers and religious leaders. But the science itself, people just had had a lot of distrust about. There are risks associated with this technology. There are crazy new cyber biosecurity risks that nobody is thinking about. I mean, you can sort of send benign genetic code to get it printed out, and somebody can inject malware during that process and get, a horrible pathogen back in the mail by accident. And there's also ways to engineer individual viruses to, there's some bad stuff, but I'm actually worried more than anything about misinformation.
Yeah.
Because that's hard. That's in some ways even harder to control than biology, which tends to self-replicate and sustain.
You talk about the 9 risks in here. We've kind of covered a number of them. You also end the book with a way forward. So I don't want to imply that this is you're going to read this and go, oh, we're screwed.
Weirdly enough, one of the strangest feedback I've gotten about this book is that everybody's like, wow, this is really optimistic.
Yeah.
I feel like you're very hopeful. This is the most optimistic take on all of this. And nobody's ever said my name and optimistic in the same sentence before.
Well, we've actually had an interesting experiment over the last 2 years with the pandemic that in many ways mirrors the kind of issues we're going to face as the Genesis machine comes to life. Our reaction to the mRNA vaccine has been very polarized, partly because it's mRNA, right? People presume it's got all sorts of malicious intent because it's genetically modified. I can tell you a crazy story. Yeah. Have you ever heard of a show called Coast to Coast? Oh yeah.
Leo.
Oh yeah. Art Bell. It's on my same syndicator as me, so I know it very well. And
okay.
Yeah.
I had never heard the show before. My publicist.
It's considered amusement, not fact.
Okay. Well, here's what I learned.
Did they put you on Coast to Coast?
Yes, they did.
With
and
George
I did not
Norrie?
know anything. Yep.
Oh my.
Who's a very sweet guy.
He's a great guy.
He's very nice. It was 2:00 in the morning, East Coast time, when they opened the phone lines.
Oh yeah. And the crazies come out at night. Oh yeah.
Yeah, but here's the thing. They're not crazy. They're just scared. And I totally get it. And there's a woman who called in who felt pretty strongly that her soil had been contaminated with COVID and didn't know what to do about it. There was somebody else who felt like, I heard a lot of stories, and I wound up doing an hour of sort of crisis
debunking
communications, and I think it's because
you got to join me on my radio show sometimes. I get calls like that all the time.
It was, well, I had a huge change of heart. I'm actually really grateful that I had an opportunity to do it.
To meet real people and see how concerned they are.
Yeah. And again, I think if somebody at the beginning of all of this had just said, let's not talk about this in a sciencey way. Let's just talk about this in a people way.
Right.
And so in 2:30 in the morning, some guy was talking about how he just wants his natural defenses, his own body to fight it off. That's better. And I said, well, I'm not a scientist, but I play a lot of video games. So let me tell you my perspective about The Legend of Zelda. So sometimes I go away from the game and my family, who doesn't love me apparently, continues playing as me. And then I return to the game and I'm on some new level. I do have tools, but I have absolutely no idea how to use them. And then out of nowhere, this actually happened, out of nowhere, there's this blobby translucent thing that shows up. I don't know what it is.
You got to work your way up. You can't just go to another level without the experience. I don't know. Yeah.
But the point is my character Link has never seen this thing before. Right. I don't know what this is. And so I don't know if I'm supposed to eat it or if I'm supposed to kill it. I don't know.
Just let your natural defenses take care of it.
Well, your natural defenses can't take care of it because they can't recognize what it is. So therefore, even though I did have the tool, I was missing the instructions on how to use it.
Right.
That's the challenge with SARS-CoV-2. It's this new translucent blobby thing that we've just never encountered before. And we do have natural defenses, but unless those defenses have a set of instructions, then your body doesn't know what to do. The messenger RNA is the set of instructions that tell your body which tools to use to go fight it.
Wonderful analogy. By the way, did that work?
Yeah, and it was like, I should do work. Yeah, well, actually, I think I did.
Nice.
And I had this sort of moment where I was like, why can't we I feel like we're just so dismissive of people.
Just explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm actually really grateful that I had an opportunity to meet people that I wouldn't normally talk to. And I appreciate them and I recognize their fears. And so again, part of what I try to do in general is help explain the technologies. I'm not always successful, but I try to explain them, whether I'm talking to our clients or I guess people at 2:30 in the morning. This synthetic biology stuff, is going to give us serious optionality. And I frankly think if we really, really want to go to Mars or live off planet, we're going to have to engineer ourselves to do that. And I think it's possible, but we're also going to have to open up our minds to other possibilities of what it means to procreate. I hope in the future we have a ton of sex, but we don't only have sex to have babies. I hope we have other ways to do it using advanced techniques in biotech and IVF. I hope we bring a lot of our farming indoors where we can control the circumstances more. And yeah, that's going to have to mean that we edit some stuff. We genetically modify things, but it's not necessarily bad. It's just different, right? And
genetic modification is not new. Since Gregor Mendel figured out that he could change beans in his monastery garden, we've been able to do genetic modification for years. And I think you're going to find people who say, those heritage chickens are much better than the modern giant-breasted chickens made in manufacturing facilities.
That's right.
And I actually don't disagree with them. So I think that kind of thought that maybe it's a somewhat religious thought. We shouldn't mess with God's creation. Is deeply felt by a lot of people, and a lot of people have nostalgia for the way things used to be.
Well, I think the religion piece is really important. So this is something else that's very different in the United States than it is in other countries. We have deeply held religious beliefs here, and we aren't great at having conversations about where we are misaligned. I think that some people automatically assume that if you're really religious, then you also must be very anti-editing life or using stem cells. It's actually not true. Francis Collins, who at some point was the director of the NIH, and now that Eric Lander has resigned from OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy, Francis is back as a sort of co-advisor in some way. At any rate, very accomplished scientist, very, very, very religious, and has written books about the coexistence of science and his beliefs. He actually believed that the stem cells should be used. That we have a moral imperative to improve life, and we already have the stem cell lines.
Yeah.
So I think we have to give ourselves the ability to have hard conversations, but to hear each other out rather than rushing to judgment, which is hard.
Yeah, very good. I sometimes though worry that just watching what happened during COVID, that feelings ultimately will trump rational thought.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, you know me, I'm always an advocate of school,
Right.
like making sure we teach kids. That's apparently becoming a little more challenging because of different political viewpoints. I don't know. My feeling is
if something's going to be politicized, it's going to be the Genesis machine. Right?
Oh yeah. So we've gotten like amazing reviews from scientists.
Good.
And we've gotten some pretty significant hate mail from people who feel like we're advocating that we tinker with life. Life is being tinkered with all the time. And this year, we're going to, in a couple of months, start getting pictures back from the James Webb telescope, which is literally going to redefine our rules of reality, like what we believe. We just have to be, I don't know. I don't have a solution for this. I'm a futurist. I'm a quantitative futurist. So I build models. I'm accused most of the time of being robotic, like a passionate robot, but like robotic. I don't know how to relate to feelings first, but I acknowledge that's reality. I heard it the other night. And so I think the best thing to do is to lead with empathy and patience, and just hopefully over time wear people down.
Yeah. I worry that there'll be a kind of bifurcation of society, and a lot of science fiction talks about this, where there's the people who say, no, I believe in progress, and those who say, no, I want things to stay as they are, and never the twain shall meet.
Right, because we haven't started, we wouldn't really talk about optimizing. So there's a movement of people who are microdosing right now, which is not genetic editing, but it is tinkering with your own neurochemistry. That's not accessible to everybody. It's not well understood by everybody. I mean, we're already subdividing ourselves in different ways.
Yeah.
I think the place where a lot of people get stuck is this sort of permanence, because once you edit at the germline, you actually do create a permanent change. Now, could you reintroduce whatever it was that you edited back out? Probably.
So that's the complaint about germline is it's permanent. But there's less of a complaint about just a one generation. Like you can have a big brain for one generation, but you can't pass it on to your kids. That's okay.
I don't, we're pretty far away from anything like that.
Yeah,
but,
let's hope so.
But I guess what I'm talking about now is like organic foods are already out of reach for a lot of people because they're more expensive.
Right.
So what happens when we not only have organic, but we also have organic and enhanced, like a tomato that has like some of the properties of Adderall, that just you eat tomato, you have like a pesto tomato sandwich and you can really focus on needlepoint or whatever it is that you're doing. I worry that.
I think that sounds good. I'll take that.
I think that sounds delicious.
You'll have to ban it. You'll have to ban it from chess tournaments. But other than that, I think it sounds delicious. Yeah.
Right. But that's the question, right? I mean, we already have a divide because some people are able to get access to neurotropics, neuroenhancers, legally or illegally. And that's giving them a leg up anyways.
Well, we're just beginning to grapple with a digital divide. Now you're going to have a genetic divide. Right. That's one of the risks you're talking about.
Yeah, actually. That's absolutely a risk. And again, we have to think this through. But we can't wait to have the thorny, wicked, challenging conversations about this stuff until it's too late.
But you know how it's going to happen because it always happens. We do our homework the night before. It's going to happen only when we can do it, and we're right up against the crisis, or the Chinese are doing it, and now we go, what do we do? You point out that science moves slowly. Absent a space race to get to the moon, most of the time this stuff moves really too slowly.
That's right, because the community tends to err on the side of conservatism. So they tend to be pretty conservative. There's a lot of regulation and different things that have to happen for good reasons, but there's not coordination. And at this point, because of the COVID, there's not a lot of people who are able to do some of that work. Again, we don't see the same processes in place in China.
Let me ask you about something you mentioned in the book, which is something very timely, and that's gain of function research. Yeah. We sent money to China, the NIH did, to do gain of function research on bat viruses because we wanted to plan for the future. But what we ended up doing is making super viruses that may or may not have escaped from the lab. You're against that idea.
Very much so. So for those of you not familiar with what gain of function is, so this is when you have some type of living organism, in this case a virus, and you intentionally mutate it to see if you can make it stronger, more virulent.
You might say, why would you ever want to do that? Right.
So let me give you a... Right. And this sort of alludes to the whole bioescalation and cybersecurity breach that I'm concerned about. So in 2018, there was actually before then, between early 2000s, there was a Stony Brook University, or SUNY, New York, Stony Brook. Yeah. Some researchers that were trying to figure out whether or not they could synthesize a live virus, just basically using off-the-shelf stuff. So whatever sequences they could get through public channels, off-the-shelf chemicals, mail-order DNA. And this project, to be fair, was financed in part through DARPA, trying to figure out how people might in the future develop biowarfare. At any rate, so they painstakingly put together these short stretches of DNA, and they added in some additional code just so they could distinguish it as synthetic. Anyhow, the whole point is that they were able to do it. They had recreated poliovirus in the lab using materials that basically anybody could get to and anybody with the knowledge could do. And we have quickly forgotten this, but at some point, poliovirus was just horrendous and impossible to stop.
It was the last time we all agreed vaccines would be a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So they did this as a warning, and DARPA was trying to figure out how to prevent this. But that's prevention. In 2011, so about 10 years later, there was a researcher in Rotterdam that figured out how to augment the H5N1 bird flu virus. So again, pre-SARS-CoV-2, this was actually the most virulent and the most deadly, the most deadly virus. The mortality rate at that point was 59%.
The cause of the 1918 pandemic and the endemic flu that we still get a vaccination for every year, H1N1. Yeah.
Right. So this scientist, what he did was intentionally, and I'm going to use his words here, mutate the hell out of H5N1 in order to make it airborne.
H5N1. Okay.
H5, sorry, yeah. H5,
yeah.
H5. Anyhow,
that's not the flu virus, just to be clear. That's
no.
That's a far. That's what is that? The bird flu? Yeah.
But he made it airborne.
Nice.
And transmissible, not just between birds and humans, but humans to humans. And
smart fella.
Right. So again,
what could possibly go wrong?
What could go wrong? Why would you do that? And the answer is because you're making a weapon. There is no reason to do that. There is no reason, I think, to do any gain of function research, because at this point, Google has figured out how to model basically every protein out there.
Yeah, that's a really important thing. Now, in fact, this is how the mRNA when you went back to Genentech trying to figure out how to create a synthetic insulin, that was a hard problem that had to be solved basically by trial and error experimentally. We can now simulate with gene folding. We can simulate all of that stuff. We no longer have to make these things.
That's right. There is, from my point of view, it is inexcusable. There is no reason to do gain of function research. And even if, so again, play it out. So fine, you figured out the most virulent strand of some virus. Awesome. What does that mean? So you're going to create some type of therapeutic or antidote or antiviral or something in the event that happens, assuming that mutation goes exactly the way that you think it's going to. There's an infinite number of ways that things could mutate. So it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So there you go.
That's the so-called mad scientist problem, which we may also never solve.
But we also have to acknowledge that that somebody, we can create these guardrails.
Militaries, I could see both ours and theirs working on stuff like that. Bioweapons. Right. Terrifying.
So, or even, look at what's happening right now with Ukraine. So most of what we're seeing is rhetoric coming from all these different sides. In fact, this morning, the separatists, there's a faction within Ukraine that are separatists that are announcing to people that war is imminent and they should pack up their things and get ready. So there's just this current escalation that is a lot at the moment about posturing, or I hope, maybe Putin has already waged a war. I don't know. But escalation is really dangerous. And the last two countries on earth that we want to engage in any kind of bio-escalation or bio-cyber escalation with are Russia and China.
Yeah.
We don't want that, and they don't want that with us. So we can figure out a way to create guardrails and make this be much more about collaboration rather than competition.
The people you worry about are the people with nothing to lose.
That's right.
And it's one of the reasons we have to have a global economy and a global society, because we have to be involved. I don't really worry about China so much because they're tied so economically, so directly to our survival. I'm not sure Russia is starting to turn a little bit into a rogue state. Fortunately, terrorists, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, don't have the scientific technologies to do this kind of thing.
We don't know. That's part of the issue, right? So I do have a concern that at some point there's some. I just want to I want to say that overwhelmingly, I think that what's on the horizon is positive. I really do.
I'm turning you into the pessimist that I am. So go ahead. You stay optimistic.
But I'm a pragmatist.
Okay.
I'm a pragmatist.
Good.
And so the worst thing for us to do is to ignore what's happening, to assume that, yes, probably nobody has anything to gain if China and the United States get embroiled in some kind of race to create superhumans. That would be terrible, and there would be all kinds of problems with that, right? But what about other places where they have less to lose and much more to gain in, for example, creating some type of crop that might decimate, like kudzu, but worse, right? If you drive up and down the 95 corridor on the East Coast, there's kudzu
the world's
everywhere.
Worst invasive species.
Right, and maybe
death by 1,000 kudzu plants.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a great chapter which you say your co-author Andrew Hessel wrote about Elon Musk. There's another example that we hadn't really thought about, but we now have some very, very, very wealthy individuals who might have their own agenda, who might have the means to pursue things like this that are in their interest, but not necessarily in society's, or maybe they're microdosing enough that they believe it's in society's interest to live underground on Mars. Maybe they think that.
Yeah. That is so right. So that's actually a greater concern that I have than somebody going rogue. The concern that I've got is that, if you take ransomware out to the next several different steps, what if somebody holds your genetic information for ransom? What if somebody breaches your personal DNA store, your personal genetic code? It's like stuff like that. What if there's malware injected? Because there was already an example of this where malware got injected into a sample that left benign and sort of came back in the mail. It was intentional.
Right.
They wanted to see if there was a vulnerability. But here's the thing: you
could do gain of function on malware as well as viruses.
Well, you can use malware to turn benign genetic code into a pathogenic virus. And I talked to some friends at different parts of the government, military folks, Homeland Security folks, talked to lots of people. And I said, if this happened for real, who's in charge? And that's actually the basis for one of the scenarios in the book. There's a scenario. The middle of the book is all short stories that are sort of fictional sounding.
They're great,
all
though. I love them. Yeah. What happened when we canceled aging? I love it.
The one that's called the memo that starts with a catastrophe and a lot of people who die inside of a lab is the basis for this sort of malware thing is the basis for that scenario. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we wrote that is because I spent days trying to get an answer to, hey, if this really happened, who's in charge? And the answer is nobody knows.
Right.
So we don't really have a plan to think through cyber biosecurity breaches.
Emergency assistance requested to combat novel cyber biological attack.
Yeah.
And who would be in charge? All right. You see, this is the problem with media. You got to watch out for this, Amy. We always want to take it down the scary path because that's more engaging. That's more interesting. So I'm going to give you a chance to cheer us all up. Give us the optimist's future.
Yeah. And again, I think anybody who has spent any time with me knows that my strengths are on the dystopian risk side, not the rainbow sunshine side.
But and I hope in your work, which you talk to very, very important people all the time, that they start to listen. I hope they're listening to you about this stuff. I hope they're reading the Genesis Machine and starting to think about this stuff.
Here's what I think is on the other side of this. We probably are never going to align on things like climate mitigation strategies. We keep having these big global meetings and there's too many economic incentives that are out of whack.
Yep.
You can't force China and India to just shut down all of their coal plants. It doesn't work that way. Mm-mm. So yes, let's keep pursuing CO2 reduction, but let's also look at CO2 as a feedstock and let's engineer some plant that's controllable, that sucks the CO2 out of the air and poops out for organic fertilizer. But that's not a silver bullet, but it is an approach that we could do in different places for the purpose of, trying to deal with some of what's on the horizon. Clothing, you can already create nylon using synthetically altered materials. This kind of stuff, again, if big retailers sort of understand what it is and they make the investments at the right time, they could continue to have fast fashion models, so the business models, and turn around clothing lines over and over again without harming the planet. Fashion is really bad for the planet. What if you bought super cheap clothing that was intended to expire. It came with an expiration date. You wear it once or twice. You don't ever wash it. You just compost it afterwards. I know these sound like crazy harebrained ideas, but the point is that the technology exists now to start doing some of that. And if we can just unshackle ourselves from trying to rewrite the past, we can write a better future. But we have to start doing that, right? And we can start doing that by at least having a dialogue about it. So.
You are right, and I hope we do. And I hope everybody listens to Amy Webb and reads the book, because you know what? It's a really great read. It's actually a page turner. The structure of it's really fun, and it raises a lot of interesting things. And I think in many ways it's more interesting and more fun to think about all the potentialities. And you know, if history is any teacher in this, we'll probably do both. We'll probably do the horrific things, and we'll probably do the wonderful things. And let's just be ready for both. Because you know,
that's wise advice.
Yeah,
sage advice.
We're gonna do them both. That's just the way humans are. Really a good book. It's my favorite book yet. You really did a great job. The Genesis Machine. Amy Webb, Andrew Hessel. It's from Public Affairs Books, but you can. There's an Audible version of this, I think. Yes.
Oh, yeah, there's Audible.
Good.
You can get it everywhere. And actually, I will reveal a tiny little secret. So the book has a bunch of Easter eggs in it that if you get to the end, there's a QR code. And if you scan the QR code, which I recognize now is like a really great way to share malware, but this is not malware, I promise. I'm the one who made the QR code. I put together a folder, like a Dropbox folder that has a ton of stuff in it. If you actually want to go down the same rabbit hole that I did. So there's videos, there's discussion guides.
I saw that and I thought that was a really great idea. I wish everybody.
Yeah, I actually wanted to footnote it and have QR codes everywhere. And that was production wise. They didn't want to do that. So I put one at the end.
There's also a bit.ly link, but that is a really brilliant idea, because I think that this will launch some people onto this journey of exploration, and there's so much about this to learn and we are. I hope. I think this is gonna. You think this is gonna happen in my lifetime? I got 20 years left. You think I'll start to see some of this, and I don't expect to get extended past the 20, but
it is happening, and you absolutely could be extended beyond the 20.
I'm not counting on that, but I do want to go to Singapore and have that those chicken rings. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Get the book. I highly recommend it. It's a really good read. The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. Thanks for joining us. A special triangulation. This was one that was worth dusting off the microphone and cleaning off the table for. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Did you spend a lot of money on your brand new smartphone, and then you look at the pictures on Facebook and Instagram and you're like, what in the world happened to that photo? Yes, you have. I know. It happens to all of us. Well, you need to check out my show, Hands On Photography, where I'm going to walk you through simple tips and tricks that are going to help make you get the most out of your smartphone camera or your DSLR or mirrorless, whatever you have. And those shots are going to look so much better. I promise you. So make sure you're tuning in to twit.tv/hop for Hands On Photography to find out more.